The first thing I felt was the December air pooling like cool water at the base of the stage lights. A draft that ran under my hem and made the paper in my hand quiver as if it had a pulse of its own. I'd chosen the community hall because it had always swallowed noise and given back clarity, because it had faithful chairs that didn't squeak, and because the corkboard along the back wall had held our town's losses and triumphs for decades with equal patience. Our family Christmas dinner had overflowed this living room or that in years past. Now it had outgrown the houses entirely. Rows of round tables were set with white clots of linen that smelled faintly of starch and almond hand soap. On the corner table, a glossy pyramid of champagne, flutes in patient, empty tiers. I stood at the collapsible lectern with my hands folded. A neat rectangle of documents on the wood, the fluorescent tubes humming like a beehive. My brother Rizwan sat at the front table with a half smile he wore like a suit purchased a size too small. He tapped his phone with a rehearsed insouciant's elbow hooked over the chair back. Lights, faces, fogged windows, the silver belly of the urns at the buffet reflecting everyone in warped ellipses. Everything in place except the champagne the family had budgeted for. A line item that was supposed to glitter tonight and instead had vanished like a coin palmed by a cheap magician. I breathed in the hall's layered smells, floor polish, roast lamb cooling on trays. Pine from the little artificial tree by the fire excitant. I gave the room a one-sentence steak before anyone could claim. We were only here to discuss a misunderstanding. I'm here to protect what our parents built, I said, the microphone making a hiss like a shaken soda settling. In the next minutes, you'll see how a card was canceled, a budget recaptured, and a pattern recorded. The phrase felt like a lid fitting a jar. I did not look at Rizwan when I said it. I watched the aunties lean in, glittering shawls, shivering with the movement. I watched the kids hover near the cookie trays, stalled by a scolding glance from a cousin. A flash from the kitchen door, metal on metal. The stage lights hummed a little higher. I lifted the first document from the stack and set it down palm paper. Woodso, the microphone, picked up the soft thud. You could feel the room's posture change. It's always this way before a controlled detonation, the oxygen stretching thin, the skin at your temple aware of your pulse. 2 days earlier, the champagne had been a line in a spreadsheet. 250 guests. 4 bottles per table, a discount for volume from Noor at the Moorhen, who ran the rooftop restaurant on Kashmir Road and owed me a favor from a night. I'd helped her reconcile a nightmare of service charges. The family budget was a shared pool we kept tidy because we were tired of the generational fog our parents' friends called the way things are. I'm a forensic accountant by trade, which sounds drier than it is. In practice, it's a mix of patience and performance art. The drama of pulling a thread others thought decorative. Numbers talk. They have breath, heat, habits. The budget had its breath scheduled disbursements. A cabinet of earmarks, a modest reserve, and its heat came from one card. Not physically present, a number that lived with our event manager for vendor deposits with strict ceilings. At 9:18 a.m., 2 days ago, I'd watched a cluster of entries rip like a zipper from the feed. A series of charges tagged as beverage vendor routed through a processor I didn't recognize. Each authorization shaving a neat crescent off the limit. I remember the air around my chair at my parents' dining table felt warmer than my hands. The table was scarred from years of our mother's teacups and our father's grand maps. The light through the sheer curtains made a small gold lake on the floorboards. I had my laptop opened, not for work, but for the comfort of its crisp edges. The charges had a common token, a hashed descriptor that told me a single merchant account was chewing through our budget. I followed the thread to an aggregator the merchant had registered with. Then I triggered the thing everyone thinks is hard and is actually easy when you've set up your documentation. I froze the card. The reversal email from the bank's events spending division came 22 seconds after my call ended. Reversal initiated. Pending merchant settlement. Subject line in the same tidy font they used for the credit limit. Increase we'd declined in July. I'd asked for the audit trail from the event manager's portal. The logs came with timestamps, geolocation for the device IDs that had authorized the vendor profiles. One of the devices had a familiar heartbeat. the IP block from my brother's office. It's the same range that pinged the family chat with his golf photos and his quick polls. I closed my eyes and listened to the AC kick in, a low animal beneath the drywall. The scent of cardamom from a simmering pot drifted from the kitchen. Mom was making Kia 2 serve after dinner. The house had the sound of someone sorting cutlery in a drawer. A clatter that comes from volunteers reorganizing without a plan. I rolled my shoulders and let my fingers find the rhythm of process. I didn't shout. I wrote to Nur, asking her to hold the champagne order, citing a temporary freeze due to suspected skimming. I wrote to the bank, escalating the freeze to a fraud review, attaching the audit trail. I wrote to our lawyer Amina and asked for a quick opinion on the trust clause in the family hospitality fund, the one our parents had signed and I countersigned as trustee. When we found ourselves bearing the weight of the dinners our mother loved to throw for the old neighborhood, I wrote to our neighbor, retired Colonel Bati, because he was the custodian of the hall and because, even as a private, he understood the public mechanics of shame and how to keep them from becoming spectacle. If I breathed carefully, I could smell the winter dust burning off the heat vents. By evening, Noor's reply landed like a small, firm hand on my shoulder. She had paused the deliveries and credited our deposit to a temporary account she flagged as pending adjudication. A phrase that delighted my organized heart. Our bank manager, Mr. Devorius. In our city of mixed names, there's always a Mr. Devora, called me from his glass cube in the branch. And the echo off his office walls made him sound both important and very alone. He acknowledged the freeze and promised a fraud analyst would scope the merchant account by morning. He'd seen enough families undone by embarrassment to hint, gently, that a narrative controlled by receipts always travels farther than one driven by rumors. Amina responded with 2 attachments. An excerpt from the Fund Trust Agreement, Clause 7B, which I had highlighted the day we drafted it and then promptly forgotten, and a letter template addressed to the members of the fund announcing a trustee intervention. Clause 7B contained a lever disguised as a sentence. The trustee may rescind disbursements and reallocate line items upon documented misapplication of funds. In order to comply with the fund purpose, I read it twice, felt the sentence click into place like a safety. I had always liked the smell of new paper, the faint chemical promise of it. And the attachments smelled like that even through the screen. I heard Mum's slippers whisper down the hallway. She popped her head in to ask if I needed the rolling pin for the pie crust. We both laughed at the retro question. A quiet house has its own heartbeat and ours thumped with preparations, with messages from cousins confirming who'd bring what. On the family chat, Rizwan posted a photo of an ice bucket squatting like a silver mushroom on his kitchen island. But the label was angled away from the camera, coy. He wrote, "Relax, all handled." I stared at the timestamp and then at the merchant processor's graph on my screen. The sums did not match. Relax is often an imperative used by thieves with standing invitations to dinner. I didn't reply in the chat. I forwarded Amina's letter template to our smaller committee. The core, me, my mother Selma, my aunt Hina, cousin Sira, and our friend and logistics angel Kamel. The committee was 5, because 5 keeps the conversation crisp. I shared the bank logs, redacted just enough to protect vendor account numbers. I attached the audit trail. I included a screenshot of the merchant descriptor resolving to a pop-up beverage outfit called Golden Napery LLC Incorporated. 3 weeks ago with a registered agent at a co-working space to tram stops from my brother's firm. It could have been anyone, I told myself, but the breathing pattern of the entries always after 8 p.m. Always in subthreshold bursts designed not to trip fixed some alerts felt like a finger tapping someone's own wrist. Checking his pulse as he moved in the dark, the phone vibrated in my palm with Sarah's voice memo. She has a voice that could settle a crowd without raising itself. "We go by the book," she said. "We put the receipts on the lectern. Neither a spectacle nor a secret." I played it 3 times. The AC clicked off. The house hummed at the edges. A car rolled past in snowlight. I printed Amina's letter template, signed it with my full name for gravity. and slipped it into the envelope drawer, the old drawer in the sideboard with mismatched stationery and stamps with canceled rates. We always added creatively to reach the new cost. My father kept a silver fountain pen in there that he claimed made men listen better. It had a weight to it that steadied my hand. I saved the pen for later. I wrote the agenda for the committee call. Scope: confirm, notify, rescind, reallocate. And rehearse the microscript we would use if anyone tried to make it about feelings rather than facts. I always carry a microscript like a spare key in a jacket pocket. Tonight's was 8 words. We're here to comply with the trust purpose. At 10:30, the fraud analyst called. He was young enough to enjoy hearing his own precise language, but he was careful, and that earned my respect. We have identified a pattern of microtransactions through an aggregator associated with an LLC that lists a director with a surname matching your family, he said. Reading from the case note, we have initiated a conditional reversal and placed a provisional credit on your event account, pending merchant inquiry. I asked for the case reference number, wrote it in my notebook, circled it, then boxed the circle. We will also record the merchant on our internal list of accounts requiring manual review for event spending, he added. There's a thrill to hearing a neutral system adapt on your behalf. It's like watching a river decide to flow around a rock you put there. I thanked him, then forwarded the case number to Amina, to Mr. Devereaux, and to Camille, who would be ready to pick up anything that fell because he had a knack for arriving with the right-sized box. The next morning, the city was all white breaths and glittering pavements, the kind of cold that clarifies your plans. I took the tram to the community hall with my gloves tucked into my sleeves and my mind on the lockbox in Beatty's office. He opened the door with a Madam Trustee, an old-school joke, and a reminder. His office smelled like linseed oil and old carpet, and the steam in his mug made little ghosts at the rim. He placed the hall's keys on his desk, next to them the binder with the rental rules, and a plastic sleeve stuffed with receipts from the last 3 events. I slipped Amina's letter and the bank logs into the lockbox and wrote the box number and its contents in the hall's logbook, so an unrelated third party could confirm our chain of custody if needed. People think the law is mostly paper, the colonel said, watching me initial and date. It's actually mostly time. When did you see it? When did you sign? When did you inform? He lifted the window shade with 2 fingers. Light slashed across the desk like a blade, then softened. When I left the hall, the bakery on the corner had propped its door open to let out the heat, and I inhaled butter and sugar with a physical greed. On the street, Noor's delivery van turned the corner, carrying cases of glass and non-alcoholic, sparkling water we had arranged by phone at our contingency budget. She gave me a thumbs up through the window, and I raised my gloved hand. Competence has a smell too. Cardboard tape, ink on manifests. I walked home with my scarf scratching my neck and thought about the way my brother had laughed when we were kids, and then the way it changed when money got involved. How it lifted at the end, like someone pressing a piano key that didn't belong to the chord. The difference between a family and a firm is that in a firm, a paper cut just bleeds. In a family, it tells a story, and we kept telling ourselves stories until the paper was confetti. When I walked in the front door, my mother had a tray of cups near the kettle and her radio, tuned to the morning show that always sounds like it was recorded in a cozy cupboard. "Did you sleep?" she asked me, and I realized my coat still held the outdoor cold like a memory. "Enough," I said. She touched my shoulder with 2 fingers, the way she always had when she knew the day would require both firmness and tact. A text from Rizwan blinked on my phone, heard the bank froze the card. Overreaction. I looked at the word and felt an old gravity shift under my feet. Overreaction is another imperative disguised as counsel. I typed audit trail indicates misapplication. Clause 7b requires rescission and relocation. We'll address today. He wrote back with a thumbs up emoji, and 5 minutes later, a photo of him outside a bottle shop with someone's arm around his shoulder, cropped so you couldn't see whose. By noon, our committee met in the dining room, the windows a rectangle of cold light. Amina wore a gray sweater and carried her briefcase as if it were a verdict. Camille clicked his pen with a calm rhythm. Aunt Hina shuffled a stack of place cards she'd printed and cut by hand. and Sarah placed her phone face down as if she were putting a baby to sleep. I watched a dust mote spin in the sunbeam and used it as a metronome. 1, 2, 3, breathe. We ran through the plan. I read the microscript. Amina reviewed the procedural assets, the bank logs, the reversal emails, the trust agreement excerpt, Nora's invoice with a hold annotation, the affidavit template for anyone who had witnessed a request to divert funds, the short note I'd written for Body to sign acknowledging the secure lockbox and inventory. "We'll keep the tone prestige calm," Amina said, and I smiled at her stolen vocabulary. "Let them talk first if they want. Then we comply." She watched me for a second too long. It's the way people do when they want to say they're proud of you, but the words would unbalance something. We carried the paper into the hall in a blue file crate that used to carry toy blocks, the handle warm in my palm. The hall's air had that slightly wet smell of a building made of honest materials. Body had the windows open a crack and the heaters on. The air moved lethargically in both directions, deciding. Noon light made the silver of the urns glow like pewter. The kids' table was a horseshoe, so that cousins could pass plates. Noor's staff were setting bottles of sparkling water in wide bowls of ice that crackled and hissed. The only champagne on display was on the flyer from the supplier, which Noor had left intentionally under a pair of tongs, a reminder of what would have been and what was now. I set the crate on the stage and checked the microphone cable. A fluorescent bulb flickered and then committed. Outside, a siren cut a ribbon of sound through the afternoon, fading as it went toward the river. Rizwan arrived with his wife late on purpose. He had an armful of noise wherever he went. People parted not out of deference, but because he never learned to share a door. He kissed Mom on the cheek with the efficiency of a stamp applied by a tired clerk. He looked at the bottles, made an appreciative face. And then the half-smile that asked the room to be in on a joke no one had heard yet. "Sparkling water," he said. Bold. I looked at his shoes, polished, thin-soled, aged, the kind that slide on ice, and then at his eyes, which didn't slide anywhere. We didn't speak. We didn't need to yet. I could smell the lamb and the cloves and the rice and the cheap floral detergent someone had used on the tablecloths. Sounds layered, the hiss of seltzer, the clink of plates, swish of a dress as Sarah moved through the room, greeting people. I could feel the small, smooth bump on the underside of the lectern where generations of speakers had worried the wood with their rings. When everyone had come and the room gave the little sigh a gathering gives when it accepts its size. I walked to the lectern with the slow certainty of a person who knows where the stairs creak. My father had taught me to begin with something the room could agree on. "Thank you for coming home," I said, and meant it. I introduced the hall, its rules, the emergency exits, the place to put coats, a joke about how we'd borrow the daycare's nap room if anyone ate too much. Then I set the stack of documents on the lectern and explained the champagne budget's trajectory in a voice designed to be both blame-proof and blade-sharp. I laid down the bank log and said the case number. I placed the reversal email next to it and read the timestamp. I put the trust clause on top, my finger under the sentence like a teacher showing a child the place to begin. I said that we would now comply with the clause like a prayer. I liked how this sentence grounded me. You can make a smaller world around yourself with a single verb, comply. I paused to let the room breathe. In the pause, a fork clinked, a baby grunted. Someone whispered my name. The smell of hot bread surged as someone cracked open the warmer lids. I could tell the room wanted a villain and a catharsis, but those belong to plays, not to budgets. And not to families who intend to be families tomorrow. The charges were routed through Golden Napery LLC, I said, an entity created on December 3rd. Registered with an agent at, I gave the address. The device authorizing the merchant profile regularly uses the same IP block that accesses our family chat. I lifted a printout of the aggregator dashboard, the thumbnails of transactions stacked like little gravestones. We have reversed the charges pending the merchant's response. We have reallocated the beverage line to Noor's temporary account for sparkling water. Champagne is delicious. Clarity is essential. I placed the affidavit template on the table before the committee and asked anyone who had been asked, pressed, or encouraged to divert funds to sign witnessed by Beauté, to ensure our record was complete. I heard someone in the back say, audited with a mixture of delight and dread. I felt the floor under me, solid but not immovable. Rizwan stood as if pulled by elastic. We're doing this, he said, hands open in baffled theater. He laughed a short laugh practiced. We're grilling each other over seltzer. The room wanted to laugh and didn't. I watched Noor carry a tray through the swing door, her expression a perfect nothing. I offered to handle the champagne, he said. You acted like I was stealing a painting. These are just transactions. It's all in the family. He used the word family like a rope he could throw and pull me with. I think he believed it. Our mother, a statue of poise, watched him with the face she wore when the power flickered. Not surprise, not fear calculation. We follow process, I said evenly. We have an obligation to the people in this room and to the promise on the corkboard behind you that when you give, it goes where it should. He smiled wider. You always needed things neat, he said, and a few people nodded because neat is a safe criticism. He looked at the glasses stacked and waiting. Champagne is part of the promise. I noticed his cufflinks, little gold squares, like coins. His hair was too perfect. This matters, because perfection is a costume. Seems I'm not family, I said, and let the words float between us, heavy and light at once. The line was old. I'd thought it privately before in smaller rooms. Saying it aloud folded a crease into the air that some people were afraid to touch. He blinked, the first break. It wasn't a weapon. It was a mirror. The air thinned. You could hear the heaters working. A child laughed and then hushed herself, as if she'd startled an animal. I stepped aside so Amina could explain the legal shape of the trust, the powers of the trustee, the necessity to rescind misapplied funds to comply with the stated purpose. She said rescind like a bell. She took the affidavit template and said the words notarized and witnessed. Held the pen in a neutral position and invited statements. She described the audit trail, not in jargon, but in gestures. The way the IPs rose from the log like little green reeds in a pond. Camille, who has never sought spotlight, spoke to the vendor outreach the clause numbers Noor had honored. The reversal emails recorded and time-stamped. Mr. Devereaux, in a sport coat he wore badly because he usually lived in a suit, stepped to the side of the stage and added the bank's perspective. Not accusatory, simply procedural, like listening to the rules of a sport one already enjoys playing. I watched my brother's face in the sheen of the urn instead of directly. Sometimes truth prefers reflection to a stare. The urn's curve made his jaw look fragile. He ran a thumb over his cufflink. He started to speak and then didn't. His wife stared at a point on the floor that must have had a thread or a stain. She didn't move. A young Kazenadum, we all still call him Little Adam, though he's taller than me, now stood and gave a quiet affidavit. Uncle Riz had asked him to do him a convenience, to process a test transaction through his campus vendor account to make sure an aggregator worked. He thought it was harmless, he said. He hadn't been comfortable. He'd done it anyway. He looked at me with a sort of embarrassed loyalty. He signed the form. Bati witnessed. The sound of the pen on paper was louder than it needed to be. Noor slid at him a cup of sparkling water like a benediction. Rizwan laughed again, but it wobbled. You're making me into a villain because you love a spreadsheet, he said. I was smoothing things. Sometimes the clean way is the long way. He raised his hands to include the room in his problem. You want a party that tastes like duty? I recognized the maneuver, moved the subject from integrity to flavor. But the room wasn't as movable as he'd hoped. Sarah lifted her chin, a little motion like a stake being set. We want a party paid for with the money we set aside for it, she said. Not with a practice that makes you the processor and the vendor. That's not smoothing. That's skimming. Her voice had a ribbon of steel in it. Amina showed the partnership deed that created the Family Hospitality Fund. The countersignatures, the record of contributions. The clause that allowed for escalation to a public accounting if misleading statements appeared in the same quarter as a budget variance. She'd prepared more than I asked. She'd anticipated this moment like a good advocate does. Someone opened a window at the back of the hall and let winter in. It reset the room. I could smell the cold, which always smells clean, even when it's not. When I spoke again, I kept my tone in the key I had chosen. Not righteous, not apologetic. "We're not on trial," I said. "We're in compliance. We're adjusting the flows to reality." I gestured to the glasses waiting like a congregation. "The champagne budget was stolen," I said, "and nice people, good people, flinched at the starkness. It is being returned. We will toast with what's ethical. The celebration is our process." The heaters breathed harder. The light shifted to honey. Noor raised a bottle like a drummer's stick. She popped the cap. The hiss was a sigh. Back home at the beginning of the week, before I'd known how public today would become, I'd found a drawer in my father's desk jammed by a swollen envelope. It held a single folded document, the schedule of contributions to the Family Hospitality Fund. With his note at the bottom for them to outdo us, not undo us, it made me smile a mean little smile I didn't share. I slipped the paper behind the framed photo of our mother holding a newborn me and our 3-year-old Riz pushing into the frame with a sippy cup. That photo had a glossy heat to it. You could almost smell milk. When I slid the schedule back into the envelope and the envelope back where it had been, I noticed a contact in my father's old phone still on the desk, charging as if it were a living thing. The letter V in my family. A single letter contact isn't a mystery. It's a shared secret that's lost its owner. I didn't open it then. I saved it for after the reckoning, a tiny thread for my own heart to pull and distract me from loving or hating too much. Another loop, another breath. On stage, I asked Rizwan if he wanted to speak to the facts. He stared at me and then at the documents. He chose bravado over truth and shrugged as if the weight on his shoulders were a coat he could take off when he got too warm. "I can fix this," he said. "I'll buy the champagne myself." A murmur, then a silence. I shook my head. "No," I said. "That's not the repair this requires." I set down a recording Amina had prepared permission for. A short call from the aggregator verifying the creation of the Golden Napery account. The rep reading the director's name off the application, spelling it twice. The sound of a laugh, I knew. The keyboard clicks. The O-of-it's so easy cadence. In the recording, my brother sounded like a person moving chairs around an already full room, convinced he was helpful. I let it play. I let the room hear the mundane parts that become terrible when connected. When it ended, the hall was a breath held in cupped hands. I said the card has been canceled. The merchant account flagged. The funds are in reversal. Provisional credit applied. Reallocation to Noor's account in progress. This is the audit trail. This is the affidavit. This is the trust clause we comply with. I said each like a bead on a string. The string is the work. We will eat. We will toast. We will carry on. I asked Bati to countersign the lockbox inventory. He did, his pen making neat shapes on the line. I asked Mr. Devereaux to certify the case number. And he read it into the microphone from his phone to cement it into the room's memory as a kind of administrative liturgy. Amina documented. Camille collected. Sarah gathered the affidavit, not looking at anyone's face as she did. A respectful blindness that made people braver. Rizwan stood again, slower. The cold air had made his eyes glassy. "You could have told me privately," he said. "You didn't have to humiliate me. I wanted to say you did this publicly when you used the shared fund for a vanity. But what I said aloud was, we are not humiliating you. We're documenting a correction. Words matter. They are levers." He made the small mistake that closes a loop. It wasn't vanity, he said, an admission disguised as a denial. Amina nodded like a judge noticing a precedent being agreed to by accident. We don't often get such clean law in life. I watched Noor pour and pour. The ice hissed like applause cut short. The dinner began as if someone had changed the channel, a soft recalibration. People took plates. Children ran careful circuits with their elders' hands hovering behind them like trailing kites. I stayed at the lectern a moment longer than I needed to. The wood warm, now under my palms, the smell of it like a church pew. My mother approached with a plate she knew I would refuse. She said nothing, but her eyes found mine and held them. We have argued in 100 kitchens. We would again. But her glance said, "You did it clean." It also said, "This is not over." She touched my wrist where the skin is thin. I heard a fork fall and bounce. I watched the little wave of heads that turned to see what had fallen and then turned away, satisfied by something else. I listened to the hum of the fluorescent light as it settled into a steady pitch. I exhaled and watched the breath travel out of me, visible as if I were outside on a very cold day. After the plates, before the dessert, we had set aside 10 minutes for housekeeping, a bland word that saves fights. I used it to do the work that would look petty if done at another time. I presented the code of use for the card, now revised. I revoked one user access, recorded, then executed a new permission matrix, printed and initialed. I transferred the contingency funds into a short-term account NER could invoice against. The wire confirmation pinned. The bank's confirmation number said aloud. Then written large on the corner of the flip chart so even the uncles in the back could see it. Amina served notice, literally, of a temporary bar on my brother's ability to act as an organizer for family fund events pending an audit. The notice was served. The term has a satisfying finality. People dislike bureaucratic verbs until they save them. I provided a link to a redacted public ledger for the fund, the QR on a card tucked into each place, said ink, and felt something like a soft wind move through the room. Relief, perhaps? Or the absence of worry that had been a background noise for years. The dessert arrived, kie, sweet, and thick enough to hold a spoon upright for a second before letting it settle. The room softened again. I drank water and, for the first time in hours, tasted something that wasn't legal paper. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from an unknown number. A photo of a receipt from a store I did recognize, time-stamped last night. 70 bottles of champagne purchased with a personal card belonging to a person who wasn't my brother. The caption said he promised to pay me back after the party. I saved the number as a new contact, Golden Neparisi. Because sometimes a letter is enough to keep a thread safe until you tug it. I slid the phone back into my pocket and let the knowledge sit there like a pebble in a shoe I could still walk in. A room full of people ate and laughed in little bursts, like summer fireworks. I watched their faces and thought, this is why we bother with clauses. When the floor was cleared for speeches, I let others speak. Hina thanked the volunteers. Camille told a story about the first year the buffet tables collapsed under the weight of the samosas, and how an 8-year-old built a new brace from cardboard. My mother said only, "You came, you gave, you ate," which in our family is poetry. When it was my turn, I didn't speak long. I reminded everyone of the fund's purpose. I described briefly the transparency we would maintain. I said, you will find on your phones an email from me with the audit report, the affidavit option, and the note from the bank. All time-stamped, all recorded. I didn't look at Rizwan. I didn't have to. He stood carefully, like a man trying not to wake anyone, and left the hall in a slow-moving line of light that the open door made across the floor. He didn't slam the door. He didn't turn around. The smell of cold came in again, and I watched 3 people inhale it at the same time. I won't pretend I didn't rehearse in my head the 100 variations of confrontation, the kitchen fight, the car fight, the late-night porch fight. But after dessert, I found him in the hallway by the coat rack. It's a corridor that always smells like wet wool and floor wax, and today a trace of clove. He had his phone in his hand but wasn't looking at it. He leaned on the wall like a man who had run a long way and found it wasn't a race anyone else was running. "You could have spoken to me," he said. The words small and true and unsatisfying. "I did," I said. "I wrote. I documented. I escalated. You used a sham company to skim from the family fund. I canceled the card. I complied with the trust. I let the verbs collect at our feet like coins. I needed the win," he said. And there it was, the little wet center of it. You make everything into a score. I closed my eyes for a second, arid. "You choose to see scores," I said. He took a breath that clicked in his throat. "What happens now?" He asked, audit. I said, "And then we decide He made a face like a boy at a spoon of medicine. "You're throwing me out," he said, trying a different mirror. "No," I said. "I'm taking the keys out of your hand." The coat rack made a tiny metal sound as someone took a hanger. He looked at the floor and said, almost in a whisper, "Seems I'm not family." He gave me my own line back as a test or a plea, maybe both. The words landed different now, as if they'd been through a wash and came out softer but smaller. "Your family," I said, surprising myself with how quickly it came. "You're not a steward right now." His eyes went somewhere else for a second. The hall door swung open, and a wash of laughter wrapped around us briefly, and then slid away. He nodded, like someone at an altar who has heard something they don't like but cannot argue with because it's carved in stone. We came back into the hall together, not because we had solved anything, but because I didn't want to script the rest of the families. Evening around, two silhouettes in a doorway. The speeches turned to memories. The rooftop restaurant night when Noor rescued us from a frozen elevator with a wrench and a lemon tart. The year we ran out of plates and the kids learned to wash and dry like a military unit. I kept my face still, my body quiet. Sometimes dignity is simply the discipline of not moving too much. When people thanked me for handling things, I nodded with a boring smile and said, "We complied." After the room had digested and the chairs had made their first tentative scraping noises toward their stacks, I packed the file crate, each document sliding into its sleeve with the precise friction I love. Bhatti locked the lockbox and signed on the line he had meant to sign. We carried the crates through the cold to the car. The bass of someone's music thumped down the street. It's a language of a different kind of celebration, and I found it both comforting and rude. At home when the house was a ship after a storm. I opened my father's phone and touched the contact labeled V. It opened to a number I didn't know and a single text. "The rule is, spend in the light." I laughed so loudly I covered my mouth. The smell of pine from the artificial tree was strong because the room was warm. Cheap plastic perfumes honesty, sometimes. I scrolled back, but there was nothing else. A single pinned wisdom. I wrote it on a sticky note and pressed it to the inside of the file crate's lid. I cleaned the table, feeling the texture of the wood under the damp cloth. It's the little divot where my father had jabbed a fork in some argument and then sanded it himself so we'd never see it. But, of course, we did. Mum poured me tea with milk and we drank it in the quiet, our breaths visible for a second when we laughed. We didn't talk about Rizwan because there would be 100 versions of that talk, and I wanted the first one to be in the morning when the heat had rebuilt its courage and the sun had decided to try again. The next day, we started the slow work. I filed the incident report with the funds recorder, matter-of-fact form that asked for a description and evidence and witnesses, which we had in duplicate and triplicate. I served the notice to the aggregator through their dispute portal with the recordings and the bank logs. I recorded the corrective action in the minutes of the committee meeting, countersigned by Amina, witnessed by Camille. I escalated the merchant inquiry when their autosponder sent a cheerful message about resolution times during the festive season. I drafted a memo to the family community list that didn't mention names, only processes and protections. I asked Noor for a post-event invoice, which she sent with an efficient flourish. Annotated paid via trust relocation per Clause 7B. I folded the invoice like a letter and slid it into the file. The names of the verbs sat in a neat stack in my head. Rescinded, reversed, recorded, transferred, audited. Certified, witnessed, countersigned. I love how they feel in mouth and hand, square, declarative, real. The first ripple was small and not at all moral. Vendors we'd struggled with in past years wrote to say they liked the public ledger and had updated our file to reduce deposits for future events. Audits make friends. I reminded myself, if your friends ship product. The second ripple was slower. Donations rose in trickles. Not because of pity, but because people dislike doubt more than they dislike spending. The third ripple was quiet. Rizwan didn't come around the house that week. Mum left a container of leftovers at his door every other day. I saw the empties return to the porch like messages in bottles. Amina scheduled a meeting for the following Tuesday to review the compliance implication of any criminal complaint we might file. You don't have to become the state to become whole, she said. But you should decide what the fund's governance requires when a trusted relative misapplies funds. And I admired how she kept us in the right pronoun. We're not punishing a person. We're correcting a process. In the evenings, when the heat ran and then rested and then ran again, the house made the sounds of a ship moving through calm water. On Thursday, I met Noor on the rooftop of the moorhen. The wind patted my cheeks like a concerned ant. The city was a map in slate and snow, and the river was a dark ribbon, and the sky was a lid that didn't want to be opened. Noor set down 2 glasses of tea on a little metal table that pinged when you touched it. You did a good thing, she said. Sometimes a clean invoice is a love letter. I laughed hard enough to cough. She told me about a fundraiser she'd hosted where the chair had pocketed the cash donations, and the only reason anyone caught it was because the florist had complained to a cousin. You made a system, she said. Systems forgive people by rescuing the money. I thought about it on the tram back, my scarf damp from my breath. Watching the city pass as if it were a sentence I could copy down and understand by writing it over and over. On Friday night, Sarah came by with a bag of those almond cookies that taste like a breeze from a past life. We sat at the table and I told her about the V-contact. She laughed and said, vengeance. And I said, virtue. And we both groaned at ourselves. We made a pact not to text Rizwan after 10 at night because nothing after 10 is ever a policy decision. It's always a feeling wearing a tie. The house smelled like cinnamon because Mom had hidden cinnamon sticks in the vents to make the season feel right. I printed the second set of affidavit templates for anyone who needed them and placed them in a manila folder with a label that made me feel extremely adult. Affit Sansa Larry. I slid the folder into the crate and felt the satisfying slide. 2 weeks later, when the holiday lights had started to look like they would be hard to take down, we held the audit meeting. The community hall felt different by day, less forgiving. The scuffs on the floor bright and confident. Bati wore a wool sweater and brought thermoses. The air was cold enough to bite, but someone had brought those heat packs that looked like tea bags, and we cracked them and held them like weird birds. Amina laid out the findings. Merchant account established by Rizwan with a registered agent, who, under questioning, said he'd signed paperwork for some young man in a hurry. Transactions were routed through an aggregator designed to help small vendors avoid onerous paperwork, not to let family funds become personal tills. There was the affidavit from Adam. There was the recording. There were the case numbers. And the bank's final reversal confirmation. It's read like a poem to my eyes. Funds returned, provisional credit lifted, misapplied charges reversed. Noor's invoice was stamped paid with that old-fashioned physical stamp she keeps in a drawer like a talisman. We drafted the consequence, a 1-year bar from fund stewardship for Rizwan with an option to petition for reinstatement. Under conditions including repayment of any fees incurred due to the reversal process, completion of a basic compliance course, our word, Kano, not the bank's, and 2 quarters of transparent volunteering in roles that touched none of the funds. Flows. We recorded it, we notarized the minutes. We served the notice to his email and to his physical address by courier. Camille, who has shoulders like a polite bridge, volunteered to speak with him in person. I wrote a quieter letter to Mom and tucked it in the recipe box under the almond cookies for when she was ready to see that this wasn't about love. And wasn't not about love either. Rizwan called me that night, and the way the room went quiet when the phone lit, his name made me smile despite myself. He said, "You've turned the family into a company." And I said, "No, I've turned the fund into a fund." He said, "You made me small." And I said, "You made yourself small and then tried to use our size to hide in." He didn't like that. Could hear the clink of glass in the background. The little throat clear of someone who isn't alone. He said, "I can pay you back." Kay said, "You will pay the fund back, the fees and the auditor's time." He said we were never like this when Dad was alive. And I said, "Dad wrote the clause." We ran out of sentences we could use that wouldn't ruin the next day, and we hung up. The house hummed with the heater's breath. Touched, the edge of the file crate as if it were a living thing that could bite if startled. In February, a donor we'd long wanted but never quite landed sent a note on thick paper that smelled like dust and power. They wanted to fund the hall's heater replacement, not because of our parties, but because of our ledger. It reads, "Like a public trust act," they said, which might have been shade but felt like sun. Bati came to the house with a letter and a manila envelope of 96 small receipts he'd found in a drawer left by a past treasurer. A man who had gone to Dubai and left his life in tidy stacks for someone else to dust. We scanned them. We recorded them. We posted the totals. It is astonishing how addictive a clean ledger becomes when you've lived in chaos. People stand straighter. People cook more. People laugh, but the laughter doesn't sound like knives. In March, Rizwan came to a meeting and sat in the back. He wore a plain sweater. He took notes. He stood at the end and asked whether we'd consider a mentorship program for teen volunteers to learn. He'd event management so they could list it on college applications. It was a good idea. Amina nodded. Camille smiled. I said, "Draft it," and he did. The next week, he stood beside the coffee urn for 2 hours explaining the difference between compostable and recyclable to teenagers who would have listened to anyone if they spoke gently and didn't insist. He swept at the end with a competence I wish he'd learned earlier. In April, he completed the compliance course, a 2-night thing offered by the local nonprofit that smelt like copy paper and oranges. And he sent me a photo of his certificate, which I printed and filed without comment. His petition for reinstatement came in May. It included an apology that neither groveled nor bragged, and a check for the bank fees, and a promise to set up a 2-signature system for any personal events he managed going forward. We voted in June. We reinstated him with conditions. He shook my hand. He hugged Mom. He did not gloat and he did not sulk, which is the rarest kind of grace we have. The summer smelled like hot dust and ripe peaches. The hall's new heaters arrived in pallets, and the kids cut the boxes into castles. We held a midsummer potluck, and someone made a trifle so perfect people took photos, as if it were a small animal doing a trick. Noor opened a bottle of actual champagne and poured 1 glass for the room to smell as a joke. And we laughed and then drank our sparkling water, and it tasted like relief. I glanced at the corkboard and saw a clipping someone had posted from a neighborhood newsletter about the family that made a ledger. And I felt the complicated humiliation of being turned into a story. We can't help it. They're loud animals. In August, on a hot night, when the air didn't move and the radio went from a cricket match to Gazelles without apology, I sat with my father's silver pen in my hand and wondered if we'd done it right. Justice is a word. Dignity is a choice you have to keep making. I thought about the line I had said at the lectern and how it had echoed. Seems I'm not family. A line can hurt and heal depending on when you cut it. I flipped through the audit binder and felt it cool my palms the way a bowl of steel cools the hands in a kitchen. I thought about how clean our little corner of the world was now, and how that didn't make us better people, just better stewards. Noor texted a photo of a sunset from the rooftop, the city looking like a circuit board with light bleeding through it. "We still owe you a tart," she wrote. "Bring forks." From time to time, someone in the family would make a joke about spreadsheets when I entered a room, as if I carried them under my coat like contraband. I didn't mind. Systems should be slightly mocked to feel human. When I trained the next generation of volunteers, I taught them the verbs like dance: steps, file, serve, record, transfer, freeze, audit, redact, timestamp, certify, witness, countersign, escalate, cite, comply, enjoin, indemnify. You won't need all of them every time, I said, but knowing the steps lets you improvise without breaking anything. We built a little reference book, spiral bound, with examples and blank forms. We put a copy in the hall's lockbox. We shared the PDF with anyone who asked. I liked imagining someone in a completely different city using our templates to gently pull a family dinner back from a cliff. The heater hummed. The hall smelled like tomatoes and detergent. The world kept being the world, and we kept eating on time. One early winter evening, right before the next Christmas season spun up like an engine, Rizwan sent me a photo. It was of a cork in a glass shadow box with a label under it, the champagne we didn't drink. He said it was on the wall of his office now, where he could see it and be seen seeing it. He wrote, "Spend in the light." I put the phone down and watched the last of the day fade from the kitchen window. The heat kicked in. The tree. We'd dragged out of the attic again, flashed its tired, cheerful lights. The house held its smells, this time cinnamon and cumin and paper and the tiniest trace of pine. I pulled the crate out from under the sideboard and opened the lid to check the sticky note. It was still there. I whispered the line to myself as if it were a secret prayer. Then I took my father's pen, inked it carefully, signed the minutes of the most recent meeting, and closed the book. Later that night, when the radiators clicked and softened and the neighborhood felt like a long-held breath, I typed a final entry into the ledger for the year. Donations received, expenses paid, balances carried, audits scheduled. I added a note, thanks to Noor for the tart, thanks to Amina for the claws, thanks to Bati for the keys, thanks to Camille for carrying the heaviest box and never mentioning it, thanks to Sarah for saying one sentence at the right time. The ledger doesn't need thanks, but people do. And I like to leak kindness into paperwork where it'll be found like a coin behind a couch. I closed the laptop and the room went back to analog. The sound of a car on wet road. The sigh of an old house. The whisper of a page turning in Mum's hand as she finished a novel that would make her cry 2 pages from the end. On the morning of the next party, I woke before my alarm. The room purple with the kind of dawn that hasn't decided whether it will be brave. The air had that clean knife cold that believes in consequences. I made a list because lists are the only therapy that always works. Pick up candles. Confirm Noor's delivery times. Place affidavit templates in the crate, even if we wouldn't need them. Print the QR cards. Pack the extra pens, the stamps, the notary seal. I packed gloves and chocolate for the volunteers because this work is hard and sugar helps. The heater purred. The house stretched its wooden joints like a cat. I put on my coat and stepped into a day that smelled like a freezer and a bakery at the same time. At the hall, we opened the lockbox and inventoried the forms, then closed it again, the metal making a reassuring clink. The windows steamed with our breath. The kids ran in a bent-kneed, hopeful way. Noor's team glided. Amina laughed at a joke and then became serious, like closing a file. Camille lifted chairs like they were parts of a song only he understood. Badi checked the exit lights, humming. Sarah placed the name cards with a geometrical eye that saved time and trouble later by avoiding old disputes about who should sit with whom. Rizwan came in carrying the napkins folded and bound. He placed them on the table in a neat pile and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. I nodded. He nodded back, the tiniest dip. We are efficient with our gratitude. Before the guests came, I stood by the lectern and looked out at the empty chairs. They always look like teeth before a room fills, a little too honest. I placed the stack of documents on the woodlight as a habit now, not a weapon, and slid the microphone a hair to the left. I touched the underside of the lectern where the wood has a smooth worry spot. And I thought of all the hands that had steadied themselves there. All the lists read aloud, all the names called, all the verbs used correctly or badly or not at all. The air tasted like clean metal. I breathed it. The room took shape in my eyes as a place where people could be better than their habits. That's not nothing. When the first guests came and the noise built, I felt the same calm I always do when numbers become events. The champagne glasses stood in their heedless tears. But this time they were filled with something that wouldn't make anyone call a car they couldn't afford. I said the opening lines I always say, simple and true. I thanked. I reminded. I promised transparency. The room settled into itself. Later, when it was time, I lifted my glass with everyone else and looked at the liquid catch the light like a held breath. To spending in the light, I said, and people repeated it because it's the kind of sentence you enjoy having in your mouth. I toasted my father and mother in my heart, my allies by my side, my brother within reach. The heater hummed. The night held. We drank. We ate. We recorded. We laughed. At the very end, long after the chairs had stacked and the floor had been mopped and the children had been convinced that fun could continue tomorrow, I stood at the door of the hall with the lockbox key in my pocket, my gloves in my hand, and the cold finding my cheekbones and insisting I feel alive. Rizwan walked up, hands in his coat, shoulders up, smile carefully stored away. "Do you want a lift?" he asked. "I'm good," I said. We stood there for a beat too long to be an accident, breathing in a rhythm we hadn't shared in a year. He cleared his throat. "You made it better," he said. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't need to. "We made it better," I said, and I meant it, and he knew I meant it, which is the only proof that ever matters, the messy, insufficient sufficiency of it. He left. I locked the door. I stood for a second with my face to the sky that had decided it would be brave, letting snow sting my eyelashes, listening to the city's tired animals settle, smelling the clean, metallic line of cold and the ghost of pine from the hall's bins. I walked home with the crate and the pen and the weight of a year that had shifted 1 degree toward dignity. At the corner, the bakery had put out tomorrow's dough to rise. In the window, a little tree blinked, patient, repetitive, sincere. I stopped, pressed my palm to the cold glass, and thought about every verb that had saved us. Rescinded, reversed, recorded, transferred, audited, certified, witnessed, countersigned. I thought about the microscript and how tiny sentences can escort a family across a thin bridge. I thought about what it means to hold a card in your hand and choose not to use it. Then I kept walking because the night was cold, because the door at home would be warm when I pushed it, because the ledger would be waiting, because the work is also the feast. If you know someone who needs this kind of steady, share it with them. If you want more stories of quiet wins and clean ledgers, follow along. And if you're standing at your own lectern soon, remember, spend in the light.